So let's welcome everyone to our webinar today. Thank you. We would like to welcome our special guest, Grant Swanable. He is one of the experts in supply chain field in the Middle East, and he has several hats. He is already working as part of Association of Supply Chain Management for years. He is our regional director for the region. And as well, Grant has been doing several of work related to studies, supply chain TLP programs, supply chain transformation projects, helping experts from all over the world to learn about supply chain, enhance their supply chain performance, benchmarking as well. So, and he has been doing consulting as part of his life as well. So today it's interesting. He has been helping all of us as partners, community of supply chain, clients, companies. So today we choose a very fantastic topic called how to become a supply chain consultant. Welcome, Grant.
Thank you so much, Shireen. And actually, I think you're the ultimate supply chain consultant in this room, and definitely in the Middle East as well. I think all my travels around various countries in the Middle East, Shireen's name comes up a lot as a person who really understands supply chain, first of all, and is able to create an impact in those supply chains in which she operates. And it's really interesting when you think about supply chain consultants, or the concept of somebody who's supporting your business. It usually goes to an individual or a person, right? So yes, there's a company that's involved, like Symbios-Consulting, but Symbios-Consulting is made up of some very good and productive people who are able to support their organizations that they work with, improving their supply chain performance. So I think Shireen is the ultimate supply chain consultant. But a lot of what I'll talk about today is really, if you think about what Shireen does and how she operates with her clients, you'll get a very good sense of what this is about. So let me start off quickly, just to before we get into the slide deck today, is just to talk a little bit about the kind of person who could become a supply chain consultant. And there's many different types of consultants, right? Sometimes the word consultant does not have a good, people think a consultant, they're just going to tell me something I already know. But there's many different types of consultants. And what we really mean by that term is it could be somebody within the organization ready, or someone from the outside, but someone who's really leveraging off their skills and expertise to try to improve a part of or all of the supply chain of the organization, or across different organizations. So this is really what it means. Now, to become a supply chain consultant, there are many different routes to take. One of the criteria or prerequisites for that is to really understand supply chain management. And of course, there is two routes to this. The one is the theoretical knowledge of concepts, frameworks, models, best practices and things like that. But the other is actually also having the backing, or the case studies behind your name, that you have experience in actually improving supply chain performance. And I'll quickly just take you down a little journey of my own. I actually started my career, I've always done supply chain management, studying supply chain management all along, but I actually started my career in a consulting company. And I was there for about 3.5 to 4 years. And after that time, what I noticed is we were presenting a lot of really cool graphs, some very cool outcomes to clients. But in some cases, in some projects where there wasn't an execution element to those projects, we were sitting and just presenting them the information, invoicing them, they would pay, and then that would be the end of it, right? But the real challenge actually comes in after that. It's about implementing what we know is correct and what we know can add value, and getting over those constraints that then come up in terms of the implementation step. One of those constraints is people, by the way, in terms of, you can have a very logical explanation or very logical output, but sometimes it's the people that get in the way. And we'll talk a little bit about that in terms of how to potentially get around that as well. So let's jump into this and see what we've got here. So I think the truth is that you will not be a consultant in 45 minutes. It's maybe a bit too short, but what I want to leave with you today is just a bit of information around what are some of the methodologies, what are some of the elements that are important to consider as a supply chain consultant or somebody who's looking to improve performance in the supply chain. So the first question is, what do supply chain consultants actually do? Okay, so I've split this into 4 key areas. The first one is about building the case for supply chain transformation. And when we say transformation in supply chain, it typically refers to a much larger change in that supply chain. So yes, we can do things that are incremental, do things that relate to continuous improvement, but really what we're trying to do is make a change, right? Have something that was happening, a process, a practice that we had, and converting that into something that is much more effective, right? And I want to use the word effective versus efficient, because efficiency is what the organization itself will do, right? With its current resources, with the way that the processes are structured, with the current skills that they have, they would usually aim to be more efficient, right, in their processes. But when we think about supply chain transformation and what a consultant mindset should be, it's about how do we become more effective, right? Doing the right things, not necessarily doing whatever we're doing more efficiently or quicker, because you could be doing the wrong things, but doing them really well. But that's not going to get you the answer that you're looking for, right? So this is the first part, is about establishing and building that case. It's about articulating what it is that we're trying to do. And that in itself can be a challenge, right? Think about going to an executive level person in an organization, or somebody in a company that you're talking to, and trying to explain sometimes simple concepts, right? Sometimes that in itself is a challenge. And I think building the case clearly for a client is really the first part of becoming a supply chain consultant. The second one is about preparing for the transformation. So in this section, it's really about us determining what the priorities are and how to go about implementing a project with an organization, or even within your own organization. So what are the different steps we should take? How do we convert it into a project? How do we get engagement from our stakeholders? All these sort of things to prepare for it. And also for me, one of the important parts about this is establishing the baseline. This is something that can be challenging, but I believe is an absolute priority. We must know where we are right now from a baseline perspective, so that we have something to measure against. This is where I've seen a lot of projects that didn't go well, where that step was not adequately done in the beginning. So I always start with the metrics, right? Where are we now? What is our current state? And of course, where we want to go, but let's understand and all agree to that current state right now if we sign it off. The current state does not necessarily have to only be metrics. It can be what we do currently from a process perspective, what the feeling of the customer is, what the feeling of the internal employees are. Are they happy with thinking that their processes and the tasks that they perform are tasks that are easy to do or hard to do? So this is really what we want to do to start off with. So preparing for that transformation activity. The next part of being a consultant in supply chain is to execute the transformation. So here's where you actually run the project. And if you've done the first 2 steps really well, executing the project is really easy, because we're going to make a change to a process, for example. And let me give you a quick example of where we see often gaps in supply chain. Usually it sits within planning, right? Not always, but I think Shireen will probably back me up on this one, is often when we see metric gaps or performance gaps, planning is a big component of that. So imagine we identify planning or a component within planning as a gap, and then we put in place the right processes to try and change that, right? Executing this and putting in place those processes, which means from tomorrow, somebody is going to have to do something differently, right? Instead of doing these 3 steps, they need to do a different set of steps. So this is really what happens in terms of executing that, and that can take time, and also the component of this where we still at this point have not yet seen a result, right? We're still executing. We're still looking at current state metrics because those things are not in place yet. So you can see the different steps that are needed in order to ultimately achieve a result. And then finally, it's about reviewing the supply chain transformation. So it's about identifying the impact of our activities. Let's say, for example, we've adjusted a process, right? And we had an as-is process. We adjusted that to a to-be process, implemented that, and now people are doing the to-be process, or we implemented a new technology which supported the process. Now it's about reviewing the impact of that, the impact in terms of the improvement in our metric, or the improvement in any other aspect that we had in that project. And I'll show you a few examples later on of items that we can look at in terms of reviewing success of a supply chain project. So there's a few key questions to be answered as a supply chain consultant. Some of these questions relate to what is supply chain transformation. We spoke a bit about that earlier. Why do we need to do supply chain transformation, right? And imagine these are the questions that will be asked of you. And how do you answer those questions as a supply chain consultant, right? Why do we need supply chain transformation? Good question, right? And we can talk a little bit about that in a second. How do we execute it? So what people do we use? What resources? What is the cost of that? How do we define success? What are some of the challenges we may have in terms of executing a change into our supply chain? Where do we start? How do we measure progress? What strategic frameworks and tools can be used? This is a good question, a question that I like, because you want to compare it to something. Yes, a supply chain consultant would want to customize somewhat, the project, because every supply chain is different. Every company has different goals and objectives, and also different contexts. But there are tools that we can use that we know work, right? That are formulas, that are best practices, that we know we can draw upon as we look at how to implement better practices within an organization. And then who has done it successfully in the past? So historical case studies and examples really go a long way. And any theoretical degree that you do in supply chain management, or a certification like one of our ASCM certifications, we always reference examples. We reference companies that have done things similarly in the past. And as your own supply chain consultant, the more projects you do, the more of your own case studies you can bring and you can create. I think Shireen has probably 7,000 examples with all the projects that she's done over the years. But this is some of the key questions that you should be able to answer, and also that you will get from your clients as well, whether they be internal or external. So let's look at the first step here. So building the case, right? So going back to building the case for supply chain transformation. So the first thing that I want to discuss here is really back to basics for a second. There are 2 main objectives of supply chain management. The first one is to reduce cost, and the second one is to increase customer service or customer satisfaction. Those have, from all time, been what a supply chain wants to do, and I believe for all time will be what a supply chain wants to do. Now, there's different ways to measure that, and there's different ways to create impact from that. And also we have, in recent times, people talking about supply chain management and its contribution to profitability, for sure. But it all comes down to cost, right? It's how much do we spend and what result do we get out of that. So as we talk about the concept of transformation in supply chain, what we want to do is to move quickly from a lower level of satisfaction to a higher level of satisfaction at the lowest possible cost. So as you start on the right, we'll use the bar on the right, this one over here, this one over here. This is a slightly less mature supply chain, right? It takes longer for us to increase the customer satisfaction or service in the supply chain and at a higher cost, right? So this would be one that it just evolves over time. We see this a lot. We have organic supply chains, right? Things just change and react as they need to. But if I go a little bit back here, I can see here, this is a supply chain with some kind of continuous improvement intervention that's built into the supply chain, where they identify a problem or an opportunity and they implement it much more quickly. But when we talk about supply chain transformation, it's a step change. It's something completely different that we're doing, right? From point A to point B, and it's a direct change, maybe even point A to point C sometimes. So this is what we want to do, is shift the curve as far as possible to the left as we can, right? In order for us to do this quickly at the lowest cost and to increase the customer satisfaction. Customer satisfaction, in however we define that, equals revenue and equals profitability for us as an organization. So there are some breakthrough improvements that are realized by abandoning the old mentalities and learning new capabilities. And current business model fit for the future is one of the considerations to just think about, right? How are we using the current model to get what we want out of the new reality? So if, for example, you had to design your supply chain from scratch, right? How would you design it? Maybe it would look different to what it does now. You, right, over time have built in specific warehouses, specific processes. You've got certain suppliers, you've built up certain things, but how would you do it if you could start from scratch again? That's the kind of answer that would relate to this point here. And then the other thing is entirely new markets and capabilities potentially. I like the example of Kodak. Many of you will know this example, right? A company that manufactured cameras, and they did not stay with the times, right? There was a shift towards digital cameras. And unfortunately, they believed that film was still the answer. Where is Kodak now, right? So this is something to really just consider and think about. And I think the pace of this is changing a lot as well as time goes by. The pace of change is increasing. And this is, first of all, allowing more opportunity for supply chain consultant to help an organization, but also really necessitating us to be able to make these kind of changes much more quickly. So that's the first thing that we need to think about. Okay, so what is it that we want to achieve, right? So there's some key things here. Essentially, it comes down to these types of items. So the one is we want to increase speed of that supply chain. For example, look at an FMCG company, or look at a company that is an e-commerce organization like Amazon, and really speed is becoming more important. How quickly we can deliver to the customer, or how quickly we can get from our suppliers. Speed is definitely a key metric or a key attribute that we don't want to get out of here. The other one, which is very important from a in the current context of what we're dealing with right now in the economy, is flexibility. There are a lot of shocks to the system. There are a lot of issues in our supply chains concurrently, right? We know there's a lot of political risk, risk around greenhouse gas emissions and climate risks and things like that, and various other things as well, right? And this necessitates the need for us to be more flexible. So that's another task or objective that we want to take. The other one is quality, right? So having a quality product. I know that Symbios-Consulting recently went over to Japan, and I know that quality is a very big component of many of the supply chains in that country. Thinking about how we can best create a product or create a supply chain that delivers quality to the customer. We know that ultimately,
if you allow me, yes, I would
Shereen.
support you. I would support that Japan, they are the ones who built quality, built in the process of supply chain. So their quality is autonomous quality. And everyone makes it with the smile, happy people, and they deliver amazing supply chain. And all of it customized and make to order.
Right. It's incredible, right?
Yes,
and I think
cool. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And the ultimate cost of quality of having better quality is lower because you reduce things like returns and things like that, of course, as well. So that's the other objective that we would definitely have. The other one is dependability. So another word for dependability is reliability, right? So how reliable is a supply chain? If we said we will deliver to you 500 units on Tuesday with no quality issues and there's going to be perfect documentation on that day, then we need to do it when we said we would do it, right? So that's what dependability is. And being more dependable is better for planning. It's better for cost because you don't have to cover variability in supply or variability in demand in inventory. So ultimately, being more dependable actually also reduces cost. And of course, you can see right in the middle here that cost really is the essence of all of this, right? Yeah, we want to get these secondary attributes right. But why? Because we reduce the cost. So that's the intent ultimately that we're trying to achieve. So how do we get there? And one part of being a supply chain consultant is understanding maturity in supply chains. So there's a standardized model that we actually use in ASCM, 5 stages in this model. First one starting at stage 1, which is a reactive supply chain. We then have a reactive efficient at stage 2. We have a supply chain that's an integrated supply chain at stage 3. We have an extended supply chain at stage 4. And then finally at stage 5, it's an orchestrated supply chain. Now, none of those terms are on this, but essentially this is what these fall into. So there's different components that make up maturity. One component is the utilization of technology. The other component is how we have developed processes and the best practices for those. The third component is the metrics and the degree to which the metrics are used to make decisions in the supply chain. And then also the level of integration of the different supply chain elements, so how they talk to each other. So you'll see right in the top one in stage 1, it's very fragmented, right? You have suppliers, you have in the business itself, you have purchasing, you have marketing, you have sales, which is all separate little sections within their own organization, and the customers are separate as well. As we move down, you can see that we start to become a little bit more connected to each other. So you have more information flows between and within the organization. And then as we move down to 3 and then to 4, you'll start to see that there's a lot more collaboration between these different elements. And a supply chain, by definition, is across organizations, right? When we're talking about the warehouse in your company, we're really only talking about logistics, right? We're just talking about the operations that you fulfill. But there's so much more of a connected chain between all these different elements. And part of becoming more mature as a supply chain is going to allow us to increase the things on the left-hand side or to improve those things, which helps us to reduce the cost, right? So that's the mindset as a supply chain consultant that we should always have, right? Sometimes you're going to find yourself going back into more basic concepts, right? And some clients are not that mature. If I look at, we do maturity assessments quite a lot with organizations, and typically we're sitting between a 2 and a 3, to be honest. We're actually really lucky if it's a 3. And I haven't ever seen a 4, even in the ones that we've done, right? And these are companies that across the board, in different companies, we've done about, I think, 80 to 90 supply chain maturity assessments in the last 2 years. So it's hard to get to the next level, but also it adds so much more value, right? So just to give you that starting point. I want to just talk a little bit about some of the broader context, right? So often a client will come to us and they'll say, I want to improve the performance of my supply chain because something is happening to my business. I'm seeing something external, like my demand is dropping, or I might see that there's an opportunity in a new market, or I might have an impact from a regulation perspective from the government, or it's the case of there's an external event, like some kind of turmoil that is affecting the supply chain itself, or it could be something like a merger, right, between different companies. So all these things can relate to why an organization would want to do a transformation project. Okay, so there's different models and frameworks that can be used. The first one I'm showing you here is environmental scanning. So this is a framework. And by the way, if you are doing the CTSC with Shireen tomorrow, you will learn all about these as well. But the environmental scanning really connects different components and impacts to parts of their supply chain. So it's almost like, imagine like you're trying to solve a murder mystery, right? Trying to connect all the people together to see who was there. And this helps to connect all these things together and the impact of them. The second one is called steeple or pestle. So this is a very well-known framework that exists, and it's really about understanding the impact of technology, of economic factors, of environmental factors, legal factors on the business, right? And how they, from the outside, impact us. And then market characteristics as well, which tends to be a little bit more insular within that specific market. But this would really cover things like the market conditions and how they're changing, any new technologies that are disrupting the market or changing the market, specifically within your industry, new target markets, new other competition that might be coming up, and also just streamlining operations for the purposes of customer requirements. So these are some of the things that help us to position what we should be looking at in the overall supply chain. Okay, then the next one, my favorite section, to be honest, is about metrics. I don't see us doing a project, hardly at all, doing a project with an organization without looking at a metric of some kind. So these come straight out of SCORE, right? There's 3 different areas that fit within this. The first one is resilience metrics, which is reliability, responsiveness, and agility. Then there's metrics related to economic, which is cost. Okay, so total supply chain management cost, which is how much it costs us to run the supply chain. So how much does it cost us to do warehousing, to do transport, to do inventory, to do planning, to do any kind of administrative task related to supply chain. All of that fits in total supply chain management cost. By the way, organizations are not always very good at understanding the detail of that, but this is something that's really important as we look at how to improve cost. And then, of course, cost of goods sold as well, which is the cost of the raw materials or the product that they're bringing in. Profit component of that, assets, which inventory fits into here as well, because we're looking at the return on working capital within that, and it also impacts cash to cash cycle time. And then sustainability. So these are more recent times metrics that we need to think about. But if you are doing a project that relates to sustainability, or instead of the metric of cost, the metric of greenhouse gas emissions, this is obviously also very important to understand. But there's environmental metrics and then social metrics as well. So this is an example. This comes out of the SCORE framework. But imagine in your pursuit of a better supply chain, identifying some key metrics, even to a lower level of these, and really saying these are the metrics that we want to improve on. Okay. So the other part of this in terms of how you would go about doing this with an organization is you can use metrics from established frameworks like SCORE that I just showed you, or the other way is to fill out a benchmarking survey. So see the results from that within an organization itself to see where they fit in, what metrics they're using. You can use a set of metrics from an internal consulting source as well. So oftentimes organizations will have a dashboard of their own already, and they'll be measuring certain metrics. It's always good to challenge some of those too, to make sure that the metric that you have is a metric that drives a decision, right? I'll use a quick example of one of the jobs that I had, maybe I want to say about 10 years ago now. But it was a job that I had where I was the S&OP guy, right? I had to come and I had to develop reports and things like that. So I was given a task that every Monday I had to create those reports in Excel, pull this data in. It would take me 2 hours to do, and then I'd have to send it out to everybody in the organization. But no one was really using it as far as I could tell. And the one day I just decided not to send it. And I didn't send it. And then the next week came, I didn't send it. And about, I think, a month and a half went by, and no one had said anything until then, until someone in a meeting said, hey, remember that report we were getting? Where is that? But that tells me that they were not using the data, right? Those metrics were not being used to drive decisions. So this is something that's also a good challenge to have at an organization. So the other one, of course, the last one, supplement some of these sources with custom metrics. So in some cases, and in some industries, and I have seen this from time to time, where an organization creates their own metric, right? So for whatever reason, we decide we have a metric that relates specifically to that organization, and that's the metric that they want to measure some kind of success from. Okay, so that's also a possibility. And then converting these generic metrics into organizational specific versions. The first step that you would want to take is to examine or discuss the standard metric, right? So this is, let's use a score metric, for example, or a metric that many of you will understand, OTIF, on time in full, looking at the metric definition, how it's calculated, and how the data should be collected typically. Then defining at which point the process calculation starts, and at which point the process or calculation ends. So what data do we include, what do we not include? And then organizing that in terms of all metrics descriptions should be recorded into one file, deciding which metrics we want to use and how they will be used, and then data collected and calculated, gathered. I like it to be in one location as well for the entire project. The other part of what you will do as a supply chain consultant is perform a gap analysis or a root cause analysis. So within this root cause analysis, it's about understanding these are attributes within the supply chain, as we looked at before, but understanding why is there a gap in reliability, right? So for example, our OTIF number is at 80%. We want to be at 95%. Why is there a gap of 15%, right? What is making up that difference? So that's a key question that should be asked, right? And there's many ways to do that, but this is something that is important to know, because knowing where the problem lies quantified is going to drive us to the correct result at the end. So this is very important to get right as well. Okay, so I want to quickly just talk about scoping and segmentation, and I won't get into detail with this, but really the one part of creating a project or an intervention in a supply chain is that you have to be very clear with what section of the supply chain are we looking at. And there's many ways to do segmentation, but essentially what we're trying to get out of this is saying, what sliver of the business are we making the improvement for? And of course, all the metrics that we're looking at need to relate to that specific section or subsection. There is different ways in which you can chop and change your supply chain. Typically, when we talk about segmentation, we're talking about characteristics that exist within a specific area of the supply chain. Things like demand volatility, could be product complexity, could be product life cycle. Are we in a new product, or is it a mature product? Is demand volatility high or is it low? And is the product complex, or is it a simple product, for example? This is a specific example. What we will do with that information is combine similar items within the supply chain and similar supply chains to make groups, and then ultimately to decide what the operating model should look like. And an operating model is where the results come. So I'll give you an example within Source. If we say that we have a very high supply variability, right? Currently, it's just the nature of the product. Maybe we want to think about having multiple sources of supply, right? Maybe we want to de-risk our supply chain by having not just one or two customers but seven customers, one or two suppliers, but seven suppliers. This is an example of how you can adjust the operating model, but that is a conscious decision that you want to make. So just to give you a high level view of what it is we're thinking about here, okay? I could talk about this for 3 days. Just more on the segmentation is the consideration of what it is and why we do it, right? I mentioned that it's looking at like combinations of certain characteristics of those supply chains. Here you can see some examples of that. Things like demand volatility, variability, supply variability, the geographic location, the customer type, what types of raw materials we have, what is the strategic importance of that product in that supply chain, or what is the profitability. These are all things that you can use to create similar types of supply chains, right? And if you look at this diagram over here, what this gives us is, if you were to put in the business segments over here and say these are the product families or types of products or SKUs that we have, and these are the customers we sell those products to, when you see intersections between them, if you add all of that up, you should get to your total revenue for the organization, right? So this gives you a clue in terms of you've done everything and you've covered the whole supply chain. But there's just an example of that, okay? So then I want to talk a little bit about, as we go into creating opportunities as supply chain consultants, right? So essentially what we want to do is identify gaps and opportunities within performance, which in our world we call defect analysis. Process disconnects, so where are processes effective and not? And then skills and competencies and practices as well. Where are those effective or not? So imagine collecting a whole bunch of potential issues in a supply chain, from processes, from performance, from metrics, and then combining them all into themes and saying, where are the most common issues that we have? Or maybe the root cause for these common issues is a very similar thing. Maybe the key root cause that we find is that we have an issue with our supplier, right? Or our contracting with our supplier, or we have an issue in planning. And being able to pinpoint those different things allows us to create projects or create interventions within a supply chain. So this is where we ultimately want to go. And what I like to do is, because we have a people component to this as well, it's really to determine who should be participating in these kind of discussions and inputs. Some of these are going to be data driven. So if we can, and if we have the data, it's often better to just use the data that we have, but also you can use inputs from different people and participants in the organization to try and find these problems. Okay, so there's just an example of the what we're trying to do. So this is what we call the racetrack. It's the score racetrack, and this is just a very nice method in order to determine interventions in a supply chain. So let me just quickly go through this and just take you through what this typically entails. So it's about engaging with the team to assess the need for a supply chain improvement project, capturing the strategic intent, the priorities of the organization, not just the priorities of the supply chain, but of the organization itself, defining the goals and setting the scope of an assessment. Under analyze phase, there's 4 sections of analyze. We analyze performance, we analyze process, we analyze practices, and we analyze people or skills. Those are the different areas that we would look at within the analyze phase, right? To diagnose the root cause and understand what we currently do, and then what we're going to do next to change that. And then under plan, it's about planning a portfolio of improvement programs, which helps to position strategic priorities within what we defined as the goals in the beginning. And then launch is about actually doing the project. So everything you see here is getting us to a baseline. One thing I'll mention here is customers or clients might find it tedious sometimes for us to go through this whole process because we're not yet doing the project itself. But there are ways to streamline this for sure. But really what we're trying to do here is to really pinpoint the problem. Pinpointing the problem is key, because then we can fix the problem and get the benefit out of that. So that's what we're trying to do through this kind of a process. Okay, so just as an example, doing a prioritization. So if you imagine coming out of that racetrack, there's potentially 10 projects that we could do, or 10 initiatives. It's then about understanding the impact of each of those initiatives, as well as the effort or complexity of them as well. So if you have a low impact and low complex initiative, this is something that's nice to have, right? Yeah, it will be good to do it if we can, but it's also going to not deliver a huge amount of return. If we look at something that is low complex, but delivers a high result, that is something you should do immediately. It's a quick win, right? And it is surprising in some companies where the red tape sometimes prevents us from doing these simple things. But these are things that really can add a lot of value And I know Shireen will have a lot of examples here, as do I, in terms of looking at organizations and seeing if you just do these three things, we can immediately save loads on inventory. We don't have to place that order anymore. We've got so many more benefits that we can achieve. So that would be where the quick one fits in. If you have an initiative that has got a high risk or high effort, and also a high return, this might be something you would think of as a sponsor issue in terms of how we go about doing this. Can be expensive, but it also yields a lot. So maybe this is something that needs a bit more behind it in terms of the sponsor of the project. And then, of course, if it's high risk, go for it, Shireen.
Grant, if you allow me, just I support you, but
Are you there, Shireen?
I think we lost her connection.
Okay. I'll move on and we can come back.
Please continue. Yes.
Okay, perfect. All right. So this is just the view of running the project in terms of conducting a project pilot. So I wanted to bring this up because in some cases you might have an initiative that you want to put in place within an organization, but you want to test it first sometimes. So it's about putting a pilot project in place. And when we talk about a pilot, you could actually segment. Let's say you do it with only a certain number of SKUs, right? Let's say it's a project that relates to reducing inventory. So to prove that the concept works, maybe you want to implement it with only 10% of the SKUs for now, test, assess, and then move on to the next step where you're going to be rolling it out. So this is an example of how to start to implement a project like that using a pilot to start off with. And as you go through this, you can then build up a business case. So it's a really great way to do this if you can, because you can build the business case which has results. Those results can be shared with the organization, and then obviously you can go ahead and do the whole project or do the rollout of the project as well. So sometimes there's trepidation with organizations in terms of you starting a new project, and this will help to ease them into it sometimes. Okay. Shireen, are you back? No?
No.
Okay. All right. So here I want to talk about the top section over here relates to running a project, right? So doing an actual supply chain project. And then the bottom section is about the people alignment component of that. So as we're executing a project. So here is about collecting the business requirements to achieve a strategic alignment objective. I think Shireen is back. Shireen, are you back?
I'm sorry, issue. Yeah, I'm just saying, last week we are used to this, as you mentioned. We see the red tape everywhere and people don't like to say the truth. Last week I had in Saudi two extreme examples. First, a new leader in a company leading it for 1 year, he is encouraging people to talk and pinpoint the problems and make the saving and improvement. And sometimes people are afraid, salespeople, marketing people, supply chain and operations people. The other one, so much governance and compliance and too many rules, making it so hard to change the process.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, go for Shireen.
Yes, please continue. I'm talking to people about examples which we see, and we see, as you mentioned, it clear. The problem is as clear as the sun. We see the sun, but we cannot solve it.
Exactly, and it's let's say anyone out there who joined the session to see if they want to become a supply chain consultant, I will warn you that there are stresses like that exist, right? So we know what the answer is. We're very confident in the answer, but there are blockers to implementing it sometimes. But that's also our job, is to get over those blockers and to try and move beyond them as well. So I want to talk here about the projects section at the top. This is really about the components of the project that we're running. And then at the bottom section over here, it's about the people or the people alignment to that. So this is something we cannot leave out, in my mind, of any project, right? Even if you think you have alignment. I've come across a lot of organizations where we thought we all understood the same thing. And then when it came to the project itself, we were on two completely different planes, right? So I've seen this a lot. In fact, I'm working with a potential client right now where I feel like we currently have a gap, and I'm trying to get around that gap so that we can ensure that the scope of what we're doing is very clear, right? So what I want to talk about here is the collecting the business requirements to achieve strategic alignment. So first of all, I know it sounds like something that you would already have done, is understand the corporate mission, the vision, the strategy, and the goals. What is it that the customer prefers, right? So think of the customer as your customer. You're the consultant, you have a customer. How do they prefer to operate? Think about that. The employee preferences as well, the requirements from any external partners or external perspectives, regulatory requirements, and sustainability requirements as well. Second part is the project charter, right? So this is a very important document. The project charter is a formal document that shows the milestones for a project, the costs related to it, the benefits expected, the resources that are needed for it, who owns the project, who manages the project, and how do we get approvals for different components of that. So it's a critical document to have, right? Ensuring that we know and have established where we are and what we're trying to do. This document is also very important when it comes to a concept called scope creep, right? Just adding in a few things here, changing things along the way. Every time a change is made, we really should be going back to the project charter, updating it, and re-signing it off, right, every single time. Because you can easily get into a dangerous position where the project has become so massive and out of control that you're not actually making money anymore. So this is really important, but very key document that you should always have in place. And then a kickoff program. So a project kickoff is hugely valuable, right? Aligning everybody in the room at the same time, making sure that you have the steering team there. So these are the people that you report back to, the executive sponsor, who's the person who's paying for the project, the project manager itself, very key person who's overseeing the actual operations of the project, the design team, and then any other members of the transformation journey or the project itself. So these are key people that need to be part of that. This is a time when you all align on the objectives of what we're trying to do. So that's really key to have these elements in from a project perspective. And then I want to talk about more on the resource and the people side. So think about different resource management components. So how do we manage the people that are doing the project itself? So at a higher level, typically we see an increased uncertainty of what their availability is in the project. We also need to balance the needs of the program and also what they're doing in their current jobs. Sometimes there are capacity constraints depending on the progress and any other interdependencies of certain things that need to happen first before they can do their jobs, right? Or before they can get involved in the project. And at a lower level, it's about decreased uncertainty because we know more or less what they're doing. And then considering only requests from the component itself, from the resource component itself. Mapping stakeholder needs. I want to focus a bit on this one, and I'll zoom in a little bit to this. So if you look at all the people that are involved in a project, especially from the client side, it's trying to almost put them in buckets, right? So see where they are in terms of their understanding of what they need to do, where the project is right now. Are they interested in it or are they not interested in it? Do they have influence or do they not have influence? And you can make different strategies depending on that. But imagine you have 10 people in the organization that you're working with. It's a good idea just to maybe with your team, just to see where each of these people are, right? Plot them into this kind of a graph and then understand where they are right now. This will help to determine the communication that you need to do with them. So let's say, for example, they have low interest but high influence. You'd want to try find a way to increase their interest, right? Maybe positioning it differently in a way that benefits them, for example. This is something that you can look at doing. If they have high interest but low influence, they're a great resource, but they can't make changes that you need to make changes. So maybe it's about helping them to create more influence with the business whilst maintaining their interests, right? So this is something that is just to consider. Okay, so it's not people, and then managing certain relationships. So how do you best manage relationships as you go through this this kind of a project? So it's about, I know it sounds old school, but team building exercises that you can do, creating goals together, involving leadership and management all the time, communicating through opposition as well. So communicating through any opposition or objections that you get. You always get people within a project that are maybe not willing to do it, they don't really want to be there. You know, maybe they have other objectives as well. So this is something that we also want to make sure that you always communicate, even though you're going to get opposition. And then something is sometimes potentially one-on-one or small group meetings to work through any opposition or objectives that you might get as you go through a project like this. Usually the opposition comes in the form of people not or worrying about their jobs, right? Or worrying about you're going to take something away from them or change what they've been doing for 20 years. And that can stress a lot of people out, right? But that's usually the kind of opposition that you get. Okay, and then finally, this is just an example of a communication plan. So for the purpose of this particular document, it says communications management approach for this project, which is a CPFR project in this location, for Cost King, which is the customer. And this is really a collaboration that explains what the project is, how we will communicate. So what are the steps that the project manager will do or take, and how frequently will they communicate, and in what forum as well? How will they do that? They said here it's a project portal. They'll use site visits, virtual meetings, and a newsletter to communicate as well. And then they'll keep records in a certain way. And also they've mentioned the timing of the communication activities as well. So this just creates a guideline for the project manager or for anyone in his team to do the communication, right? So this just helps to determine that that communication plan. Okay, and then I just have 2 more slides left. So then this one is just looking at the example again of the charter, right? These are some of the elements of the charter, the project charter that we spoke about earlier. And then here's just an example of typical roles that you would have in a team that was working on a supply chain transformation project, right? And you'll note here that I haven't put a consultant here specifically, because the consultant would sometimes be the project champion, right? And sometimes maybe a leader of one of these core teams, but it does depend on the project as well in terms of where they will fit in. Usually the extended team is people within the organization itself that are helping to support with data, insights, and information. Okay, so finally, reviewing impact of a supply chain project, right? So there's different ways to understand the impact or the benefit, hopefully, of that project. So the first one and the most obvious one is measuring the business performance on the metrics, right? So we looked at the metrics in the beginning. Hopefully we had a baseline for those metrics. Now, what was the achievement of them? We were at 80% OTIF. Now that we've implemented the project, we're at 90% OTIF. We've improved by 10%. There's a key outcome of that project. Capability performance metrics as well. So the way in which we are able to support the overall metric, right? So let's say more secondary metrics that could also benefit. Change management performance metrics as well. And capability, also we talking about skills within people, right? So our ability to do the job better, to be more effective at that. And then change management performance metrics too. So the level of adoption of new processes and things like that. That's a very good way to see that. Operations performance metrics as well. So again, business performance would be things like cost, profitability, revenue. Operations performance would be more of the supply chain metrics like inventory days of supply or forecast accuracy or things like that. The level of standardization as well. So being able to standardize different processes that maybe we had in different geographic locations, and now we have standardized SOPs and standardized processes. This is an example of that, how many we now have standardized, and then simplification as well. So the number of steps it takes us, or the amount of time it takes us to perform a certain outcome within an organization. Simplified, this could also be a way to measure the impact of a project. Okay. All right. And then finally, just thinking about the ongoing lessons learned and project feedback. So this is just looking at like what we can do within a project itself, right, when we're working on it. So checking and rating completion and performance. So at how far are we into the project? Which milestones have we achieved and which have we not? Executing corrective actions where needed. In some cases, I'd say there could be a go or no go within the project itself. Sometimes, very, very seldom, but it does happen, where there's a change in objective in the organization, the leadership might change, there might be an impact from an external event or something like that. And sometimes it's better to abandon the project, right? Yes, we might get less benefit, but sometimes the cost exceeds that and it was not planned for. Don't just do it because we said we were going to do it and then we're just going to spend more money, right? That's a sunk cost and we're just going to perpetuate that. But that's an example of where an extreme case of a corrective action. Then conducting post-mortem meetings on how to improve and compiling and presenting feedback to a steering committee at the end, right? In terms of what the project delivered, what results it had, and hopefully you as a supply chain consultant will then be able to invoice and get paid. So I know we're at the end of the time, right on time. So thank you so much for your time today. I am still available for any questions that you might have or any additional comments, Shireen, from you, the master of supply chain consultants in the Middle East.
Thank you, my friend. I think everyone is lucky to have you, Grant, and learn from you.
I'm lucky to have them.
It took us years to learn many things, and I learned from you today as well. So one question. I believe most of supply chain transformation projects are around multi-objective post-function optimization.
Yep.
That's a question. Is that what he believes? So do you agree?
Oh, is that? Sorry, let me quickly check. I can't see the screen here. 1 second. Well, yeah, I'd say
it's cost only. It would be a lot of things.
Yeah,
Sometimes
exactly.
Don't look at food. Yeah.
I agree. In fact, I'd actually say, Shireen, it's probably not. I'd say cost is there, but it's usually not the primary objective in my experience, right? Usually it's about improving a customer service or reducing inventory and things like that. And yes, we calculate the cost, but usually the cost is almost a function of a directive of something that needs to happen. So I'd say it's important, and there are many objectives that typically exist. And I would also want to say that it's up to us as the consultant to define what the metrics should be, right? We need to understand from the client what they're trying to do, and then to implement a metric that measures what it is that they're trying to achieve, right? Or give them guidance on that. So I'd say, yeah, that it's not wrong, Mohammed, but I think there's probably a different component to it as well. I see the next question.
One is asking your question, about what are the certificates for supply chain consultants? What core qualification or certification required to become supply chain consultant?
Certified in Transformation for Supply Chain, which is a APIC certification, and Shireen is actually starting one tomorrow. You might be a little bit late for tomorrow's one, but definitely there are some coming up with Symbios-Consulting. So that is a lot of what I was sharing today is incorporated within the CTSC, the Certified in Transformation for Supply Chain. And what that certification covers is it doesn't cover the basics of supply chain. It assumes you know what a supply chain is, how it runs, what warehousing means, and all of those things, right? It's beyond that. It's about how to identify gaps and opportunities, how to quantify those gaps and opportunities, and then how to bridge the gap from where we are now to where we want to be. So it's a really great certification to do, and it's well within the scope, I'd say, of supply chain consultant, continuous improvement manager, excellence manager, those kind of roles, 100%. You could also learn, the SCORE framework. Those give you more of the technical knowledge of the best practices that exist. I would also recommend that as well. But CTSC is a perfectly fit certification to how to become a supply chain consultant in 5 days, though, not 45 minutes. So that's a very good example of that.
And if you allow me to be a supply chain consultant, you need as well to look at CSCP, body of knowledge, ensure you have it because it's important. CSCP has a lot of basics and core content for any supply chain professional and director.
Yeah, exactly. So Mohammed Hefnawi, yes, 100% agree with you. It's about minimizing cost and maximizing customer satisfaction. In the end, that's always what we're trying to do. In a supply chain, whether you're a consultant or a person in operations, that's what we're trying to do. The layer below that is the route to get there. So that's exactly correct, and I completely agree with your comment. Let me go to another question, Shireen. So I see the next question is there any way to get the session recorded? I think it is recorded, right?
It is recorded and it's on your YouTube channel, will be uploaded and presentation will be shared as well.
Great. The next question I can see is it a career for entry levels as a junior consultant? I like that question, and I think I myself started in consulting. So where I saw the value of that, the one part was the value add in terms of the mindset and the way of thinking, right? So it was about adding value. That's what I learned as a junior supply chain consultant when I started my career in supply chain. I moved over to operations though at some point because I realized that I also needed to understand the operations. And in fact, having the operations made me a better consultant because I was working in a warehouse. I understood what was happening in transport, in operations, and I think that was a good combination that I had. But yeah, I think definitely it's a good career for an entry level if you want to get a broad range of experience. The other nice part about being a consultant is you don't do the same job all the time, right? You're doing different projects. So those projects have a start and an end. You learn something new in every organization that you go to, and it's an accelerated way to learn. So I definitely think there's a case for that. Huria, that you asked that question. I think Mohammed Ishmael asks, is there... Yeah, go for it.
If you allow me to people who are juniors and people who are seniors like us, don't fall in the mistake. There is no one size fits all. Every company has different type of supply chain, different challenges, different parameters. So we as consultants, we have to be flexible as well to learn the business model. We can't go thinking we know everything. It will never work like that.
Yeah, I still, every project is unique. I still learn almost from scratch, it feels like every time. Like when we're thinking about mapping a new supply chain, how they operate, and it's fascinating, right? There's definitely this base of similarity, but the nuances are so diverse and different.
Can I add something?
Absolutely.
Yes, it's about like a maturity of supply chain in all organizations is not the same. They have the same values, but different maturity levels. So that's why it's not one size fits all. That's why we need to understand exactly what's happening there in this organization. Then we can try to apply the equations we know to let them transform their supply chain. I think this is the way.
Absolutely. Very well put.
Thank you.
All right, I'm just checking any other questions. So some about the webinar. There's a WhatsApp group. That's cool. I had a supply chain, this is Asma. I had a supply chain studies, but I worked in quality and process and R&D. Is there a way to return to supply chain? If yes, how is it possible? Well, yes, it is possible. you studied supply chain, you were in R&D as well. I mean, I think you can definitely make the leap back into supply chain from R&D. It's possible. Go for it. I think that's my answer for that one. Is it a good decision to shift from SAP MM consultant to supply chain consultant? Well, I think you're doing conceptually, right? So let's say you're implementing SAP in an organization. It's the technology part of the consultant. So usually when people think of consulting in general, they think of three things, right? It's how we change process, how we change, it's process, technology, and people, right? Those are usually the things that come to mind, the three different areas. And you'd probably be focusing on the technology quite a bit as a SAP consultant. And maybe with the supply chain one, it's about the process as well. That could also be a key component, also maybe the people to an extent as well. Usually it's process first and then everything follows process, but it depends on the organization and what the objectives are. So I think having a broad range of skills is an important attribute to being a supply chain consultant, right? So I would definitely say that, not only in one area. Yes, technology is a very valuable skill, but also process engineering and also people management and skills and practices, of course. So every one of those is important. And then the next question is, what is core skills to have as a supply chain consultant? Okay, well, that's a great question. I think I want to say that there's a number of elements to this. Some of the elements that you might not have considered is actually one of business development, right? Sales is actually a characteristic that you probably need to have as a supply chain consultant, because you have to go out and sell projects, right? You need to go talk to clients and be able to position your offering to those clients. So that's something I would definitely add to the pot, right? Business development, being able to talk to clients, being able to position things, create commercial proposals and things like that. That's very important. Of course, the technical knowledge of supply chain, right? People look to you to be the leader or to be the one that knows the answers, or at least know what questions to ask, right? I'd say that's a very key distinction, but understanding the context and knowing what the right questions to ask are, what the right data is to collect, and then collecting that's a very key skill that I'd say is important to have as a supply chain consultant. Okay. Then I have another question. I think the last question here is from Reda. How can a supply chain consultant design a resilient and sustainable supply chain strategy that balances cost efficiency with risk mitigation, especially in the face of global disruptions like pandemics and geopolitical conflicts? So it looks like an easy question there, Reda. I'm just kidding. It's the nature of, if you could find the answer to this, I think you'd be very wealthy, right? Because people would pay you to do this. There's many techniques that an organization can do, or a supply chain consultant to do, to help mitigate some of the risk. One of the areas that I would recommend is thinking about what the strategic objective is of that supply chain. So when you think of the inherent risk in that specific supply chain, maybe you want to look at the attribute of agility. How do we become more agile, right? And building agility in the supply chain is about looking at our supply base, looking at the way in which we do planning, looking at the way we put inventory in different places. And we can become more agile, but usually there's a trade-off, right? So sometimes it's a trade-off on cost. You can put inventory everywhere. Just put it in every warehouse, put loads of it there, so when a customer places the order, it's there, but that's going to come at a cost. But I think those things are about balancing that, right? And understanding that. I think the worst case is that it is unplanned, or you weren't aware that you were going to incur the cost. I think looking at it proactively, looking at potential risk, the pandemic, geopolitical conflict, etc., and scenario planning that risk, making a decision based on what we think is best. I think that's the best route to go, right? You'll never be able to solve for everything, but that is definitely a way of thinking that that should be within a supply chain consultant's, box of tools. Any last words, Shireen?
No, I think it's perfect. You have covered very important and touched very important topics, and we all need to learn. And I think
Sure.
the supply chain is never stops. So we have to keep learning every day.
Absolutely. And that's what makes it so exciting. Thank you so much, everyone, for your inputs today. Thank you for listening. We had a lot to go through today, so thank you for everything, and much appreciated. If you have any questions, Shireen is always available. Ayman is always available. Thank you, Ayman, for the great organization, and absolutely can answer any questions that you might have going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Bye.